So it's great to be here. I was really inspired by Dr. Stanley and Dr. Raines and their talks today. I was reminded, listening to Dr. Raines, that I made the decision to leave the Mass General where he chose to stay. And I did it, I think, probably a generation before he was there. And there was not the infrastructure in place at the time I was there to support the kind of work that he wants to do. And that had a lot to do with why I chose to go home to Texas and start things on my own. And then last night I was reminded over dinner that there are few places in the world where I could stand before a group of this size and present my last 20 years of work, knowing that half of the people in the room know more about what I'm going to talk about than I do. But I must tell you, this is ISAP, and it's very impressive, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I really do feel at home in this group. I felt that last night, so I'm honored to be here. I'm an anesthesiologist, and somehow I think that choice of profession is related to the fact that I don't like pain. I don't like it in myself, and I don't like to witness it in others. 22 years ago, in the middle of the night, my wife gave birth to our first child. We named him Scott. I was on staff at that hospital, so when the nurse came in the next morning and told us it was time for his circumcision, I carried my little Scott and followed him through the doors where dads don't usually go. I thought it was one of our first bonding experiences, and I was thinking maybe there'll be better ones later, Little League team, I'll coach there, go with them to the Boy Scouts. But I remember all too clearly, and I'm grateful that he doesn't, what happened next. The pediatrician took a scalpel, and without any sedation or no local anesthesia, he began to cut. My son was screaming and writhing in pain. It was my new little boy. And I tried to hold him gently but firmly. And if I'm making anyone in the audience uncomfortable, I apologize for that, but it's exactly my intention. As I tried to soothe him, the doctor said, "You see, he doesn't like the fact that you're holding him still." And I said, "No, he doesn't like the fact that he's in serious pain." There's only one word for that event that I witnessed that day, and it was barbaric. Later, I asked the pediatrician, not nicely and collegially, if he had ever considered IMLA cream or a local anesthetic injection or nitrous oxide. And his principal concerns in his response were about patient safety and his lack of training in some of those techniques, and, as you would expect, practice efficiency. I was puzzled and disappointed that there weren't better solutions for the non-anesthesiologist physician that would better enable them to mitigate the fear and pain associated with their medical procedures. I walked around the hospital to observe other medical procedures being performed without an anesthesiologist in attendance, which isn't something I spent a lot of time previously doing. And I started talking to my colleagues in those professions. I had a lot of questions. My wife had only one: where in the world had I gotten off to? I considered the whole field of sedation over the next couple of years and looked at all of the range from home use of narcotics, opioids, and analgesics without any monitors or any witnesses for post-op pain and other things, to same drugs, different dose to full effective general anesthesia, and recognized that if I was going to contribute in that field of fear and pain management, as I described, that it would have to focus on moderate sedation because of the risks involved at higher levels. Because we practice monitored anesthesia care, I came into this somewhat boldly feeling surely I was an expert at moderate sedation. Something like 1/2 the dose is 1/2 the effect, and maybe that's about 1/2 the risk. And so when I began to review the literature more carefully, generously I'll characterize that it was not studied with the precision that we are used to in our profession of anesthesia. There wasn't much formal training. There weren't many formal standards of the practice like we have in our field. My curiosity was truly piqued. And the questions that I began to ponder were, if you wanted to do a better job in moderate sedation, what would be the best tools for the non-anesthesiologist physician outside the OR practicing non-anesthesia, but rather moderate sedation? I began to ask the questions Dr. Stanley is referring to about what if. Very simply, what if you standardized the practice of moderate sedation with the best drugs, dosing algorithms, and monitors, and provided appropriate training, and importantly, monitored the patient's response to the drugs and used that patient response as input to adjust further drug dosing? In that setting, what would be the risks and the effectiveness of that approach? So what did I do next? We've heard it in different ways today from Dr. Range, for example, and my story was remarkably similar, although I had left Harvard and I therefore didn't have some of the challenges of working with an institution. But what I did 19 years ago when this little guy turned 4 was I founded an engineering company and named it Scott Laboratories after him. And the purpose was to answer questions, to find better ways to manage fear and pain for patients like Scott and millions of others, we'll talk about that in a few moments, who tolerate unreasonable levels of fear and pain because they don't suffer quite enough to require an anesthesiologist in attendance. That was really the focus of that work. I've begun to judge my projects in part by the quality of the company they require me to keep. On this project, I began to work with some of the most remarkable people I've ever known in my life, and who through the years have become dear friends. Many are surprising to me in this room today. And they include some of these, and some of those, by the way, are not current photos. I have to confess that. But I began to hire engineers in our company, and I was initially supporting this out of my salary in the anesthesia practice. We developed research breadboards. We went into early phase clinical trials with those research breadboards, largely at UCSF, some at University of Louisville. We had a focused interest on fast-off drugs. And the question that we found interesting was, could software and training change their safety profile for this new audience of users? So could software specifically constrain drug administration while testing the patient's responses to the drug, titrating to the just right sweet spot, watching at millisecond intervals for adverse physiology, and automatically turning off the fast-off drug when early signs of trouble emerged? This concept was new when we began, even a little intimidating. After all, there's no one in this room who's trained in our field that would even consider tolerating such a thing. Think about what that means. Your anesthesia machine might turn off your anesthesia drugs because of a low oxygen saturation. It's preposterous, we would all believe in our own practices, but this was a different user, a different use, and a different environment of use. Let me show you the reasons that we were excited about the opportunity. Let me be sure I know how to use this thing here. Okay, good. Okay, I'll explain this later, but Sedasys was developed to target this exact range of moderate sedation, and it's the upper limit of moderate sedation. I'll tell you how we do that more later, but in that context, I'll show you the power of automating off, and this work comes from some research that was done by Dr. LaPierre and Chairman Talmadgegan. I'll take a few moments on this particular slide because it's important. The work that they did was the propofol effect site concentration on the y-axis, and then remifentanil on the x-axis, but they modeled this work with fentanyl kinetics. Sorry. Okay, thank you. So they have, as you've seen Dr. Egan's work before, an isabole representing a 95% probability of responsiveness, and that is a patient that is capable to some level of self-recovery. The models that they built showed 3 different dosing regimens, but specifically here is the regimen that Sedasys uses in its algorithms. And what you show in this work is that if you dose as Sedasys doses and then you turn off the drug infusion, it takes 1 minute for the patient to get down below the isabole, representing a 95% chance of a patient being capable of some level of self-recovery. So it's a different level of dosing than we're used to. I had him one time model my use of propofol in the GI lab, and I recall that it was just quite different in its bolus effects. And so this is a very different approach that we tried to build into a system. So we had a direction at this point, but it was clear this project was far bigger than me, and I understood very much Dr. Rain's sentiments in some phases of his work. It was bigger than me because I needed great engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical, software, human factors analysis, industrial design, manufacturing engineering. Finland, and met with Datex before they were Datex Omida, before they were acquired by GE. I didn't actually see those reindeer, I have to confess, that was a travel photo. But I did see this site. This is the largest fish market in the world, and it was Dr. Makoto Ozaki who took me there. And we were working together with Nihon Kohden, which is essentially the Hewlett-Packard of Japan, to look at the possibility that they might be the right partner on this project. Next, I went to Lübeck, Germany, and visited with Dragerwerks there to see if they might be the right one. And I must tell you, with all respect to Dr. Ozaki, that it was in Lübeck, Germany that I discovered the greatest sushi dish in the entire world, I have to tell you. So I hope someday we can share that one also, Makoto. In addition to traveling internationally, I visited with more than 10 major United States companies, and there was one company that really got it, that really understood the unmet need and the scope and size of the circumstance that we were facing, that indicated a willingness to engage in the challenge, and that was Johnson & Johnson. And I must tell you, I couldn't have possibly picked a better partner for our work. They brought in capable leadership, built a team that over the years that we've worked together has come to have even more passion about this mission than I do, and I did not think that that was possible. So I licensed to Johnson & Johnson about 40 patents in the field. So this is my conflict disclosure. If I say anything positive about Sedasys, factor it with that knowledge. If I say anything negative about Sedasys, you can take that to the bank. I'll try to do neither and stick with the facts in keeping with the society's ethical guidelines. One of the first things that Johnson & Johnson, the division was Ethicon Endosurgery, one of the first things they did was they impaneled a remarkable group of leaders in anesthesiology to guide further development, revalidate every single decision that had been made over several years prior to that, This group worked together for 3 solid years at very little pay and came together several times a year, consulting on all safety decisions that were built into the software, and all additional software design elements, and then clinical trial design. Some have asked appropriately, is there a significant and legitimate body of research behind this technology? I'll just flip through a bibliography briefly, mostly to make the point that there is, but then secondly, that most of the literature, at least the early literature, was published in journals in our profession. It won't always be that way, but it has been that way to date. As I look at the timeline for development, I measure it in lifetimes. In the time it took from when I founded Scott Laboratories until Sedasys got to market this last year, that little guy has grown up and left home. Progress in all things takes time, as we all know. So here it is. Sedasys, it's for personalized propofol sedation, precisely matched to each patient in real time. And that in real time was truly the innovation from the beginning that has been realized in the final embodiment. The device uses monitors including capnometry, oximetry, ECG blood pressure, and a device we call ARM. It's an automated responsiveness test. There is an earpiece that a patient wears that says, please squeeze the button in your hand, and at the same time, a handpiece strapped in their hand vibrates. It has a button on it. If they press it, that way the device knows if the patient is or is not responsive. And then there's drug infusion along this axis here. And these two, monitoring and drug infusion, talk to each other. So when does a patient lose responsiveness to ARM? Well, that's what we were talking about earlier. Dr. Anthony Doofus did the studies at UCSF at the time. He's at Stanford now. He did them with Dr. Sessler. Dr. Schaefer analyzed the data, which showed a remarkable finding, and that was that patients stopped responding to this low level of audible and tactile stimulus about 1/2 of a mic per mil effect site concentration below the transition to deep sedation, and it was a consistent response. So how does Sedasys work? Here's an animation that I think gives a reasonable start to the answer to that. There are these physiology monitors that deliver patient state information to a trained care team that includes a GI doctor and a nurse. They provide drug dosing that is targeted at moderate sedation with substantial governors, and I'll describe those for you in more detail in a moment. Those are a little bit like if you've ever gone bowling with your younger kids before they're very good. They're the rails on the side of the bowling alley, but they're there to create safety. And in my view, it changes propofol. Propofol is not the drug we think of in an empty in a full vial when it's given in a very governed way. That is given by the propofol pump. The physiology monitors also, through the use of the ARM device, allow titration to effect, and the physiology monitors provide guardrails for automating off, as I described earlier. Dr. James Martin, who's here in the audience today, is a PhD trained in Dr. Ty Smith's Department of Anesthesia, just for your interest. And he developed truly brilliant drug administration algorithms that allowed propofol to be administered on label, despite the fact that it is a, let's say, a regulatory compliant form of TCI, the thing that most in the audience would love to see more frequently in our world. He did that in a completely regulatory compliant way, and it's amazing work that he did. I'll show you a few pieces of it in a moment. But basically, a user enters the weight and dose targeting the patient in ranges of moderate sedation, and they're trained to do that. The system calculates with that a loading dose, and then Intermittently, the user can offer a PRN dose of 0.25 milligrams per kilogram of propofol, so 1.7 cc's in a 70 kilogram patient for transient episodes of discomfort. There are many dosing constraints built into the system. For example, the maximum initial rate. The loading dose is given over 3 minutes, not as a bolus. There are lockout timers that are tuned to propofol's kinetics that include a 3-minute wait for maintenance rate increases and a 90-second lockout after each PRN bolus, which is, as I mentioned, the small 1.7 cc approximate bolus. And then maintenance rate increases are limited if the patient is not responding to their responsiveness monitor. So lots of ways that the drug is governed. This is a comparison of 2 papers with 2 different drugs. One is midazolam, and the other is propofol as given by Sedasys. This is the range of moderate sedation, and this is over the time course of EGD procedures, or actually colonoscopy procedures. What you can see is in the usual dosing regimen of midazolam, when the scope is removed, the patient still has a substantial effect and is often easily above moderate sedation ranges. And then this, with the propofol dosing, you can achieve an early steady state, and then you begin to titrate back and downward as the procedure changes. For example, once there's less pain when they reach the cecum, you can tolerate a lower level of drug. And then there's a quicker recovery, as we know, with propofol's kinetics. There is an innovative oxygen delivery system. Specifically, the pulse oximeter speaks to the O2 control, and if the oxygen saturation begins to go down, the cannula flow rate increases. I'll briefly review some of the alarm algorithms. There are red alarms, as you would expect, for low and high heart rate, low and high blood pressure, and high respiratory rate. None of those control drug delivery. There are 2 red alarm states that stop drug delivery: low O2 sat and apnea. The earpiece tells the patient, take a deep breath every 10 seconds during that red alarm state. And then the O2 flow is increased to 12 liters per minute during a red alarm state. When a red alarm state stops propofol, then the clinician must restart the infusion. There are yellow alarms that guard against potential compromise that include low oxygen saturation and hypoventilation and apnea. There are relatively conservative thresholds on the yellow alarm states. For example, it starts at an SpO2 of 92, which suspends drug delivery. If that alarm clears, then the drug delivery resumes, but at a reduced rate. So legitimately, you would ask, how effective is the Sedasys system? I'll walk you through the Sedasys pivotal study, which was the largest pivotal study ever performed in the history of the United States for a device of this class. It was 1,000 patients that was designed to compare the safety and effectiveness of Sedasys to the current standard of care, which is sedation by a GI care team with midazolam during routine endoscopy procedures. The study divided the group into half, about half in the Sedasys group and half in current standard of care. Half of those, a little more than half of those got colonoscopy, and the other group got EGD. It was a multi-site, randomized, but non-blinded trial. The primary endpoint was oxygen desaturation as a surrogate for injury. The measurement that was chosen was area under the curve for desaturation, because I saw in that environment some fabulous nurses, and comparing what they had to what I had back at home, I recognized that I wasn't up to par. And so we went back and made some adjustments, and almost immediately we began to have just great success and satisfaction with the doctor, the patients, everyone in the environment. But it is important to pick nurses that want to gain new skills and really want to elevate their importance and value in their environment. And this gives them an opportunity to do that. Virginia Mason is the lead user in the country, and so here's a little bit of their data. I spoke to the head of their GI unit yesterday in preparation for this to get the very latest data. They have now sedated more than 7,000 patients. Their single most challenging case was laryngospasm during an EGD that required bag and mask, removal of the scope, and bag and mask for less than 90 seconds. There were no complications with that patient. Patient was successfully sedated later that day, and there have been no calls for rescue from the anesthesia department to date. They do report notable improvement in their nurses' skill sets, no surprise in that regard, and improvement in patient satisfaction scores between 2014 when they didn't have the device and 2015 when they do, and also reduced recovery time and reduced recovery room staff. Particularly at the end of the day, they don't have variability in when patients go home, so the last patient to go home is the largest driver of their staffing costs, and they have a substantial decrease in the amount of time patients stay in the institution after the procedure. So another part of the discussion is really why I'm here. As I said, there are people more qualified to talk about the kinetics or even the engineering in this device without any question. I'm here to encourage alignment. There's this thing that goes on. Okay, Johnny, this will sting a little, or it will only hurt a second. And I'm here to talk about telling the truth to our patients. I also recall an episode with that same son, Scott. I hate to pick on him. I asked him, by the way, if he'd like to come to any of these. He's never come to one. He says he doesn't want to hear this conversation about him and other things going on in his life. But he was 7 years old, and if he were here today, these are the words he would say. The day that I took him in to see an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and I allowed that doctor to remove an ear tube in the office, was the cruelest thing that's ever been done to him. Now, some of you at least have children that you love, so think about that statement and the reality of the circumstance. I love my 5 kids, and there's just no one in the world that I would willingly and complicitly give one of my children over to assault and batter them. No one. A teacher, think about it. No one would I allow to assault and batter my children. But a doctor, because that doctor says I need to do something that's good for your child, and then I will allow that kind of unmitigated fear and pain. And my son would tell the story today. Worst thing that's ever been done to him, and I allowed it to happen in his, think about that. So I call it the oddest transaction and the collective blind eye, and I'm complicit in turning my blind eye to that. And I'm an anesthesiologist. Because the reality is it's not going to hurt a little or just for a second. It's going to hurt a lot, and it's going to hurt until I'm through with you, is what the medical specialist says. That's the oddest transaction, and we as a medical community turn a blind eye collectively to that reality. And it's not an unusual story. There's not something weird about my oldest son, okay? If you look at the medical specialties that perform painful procedures without an anesthesiologist present, I've quantified it. If you want to count, it's more than 100 million procedures per year. And you can think through what procedures those are by the specialties listed. 100 million procedures per year. It's not an occasional oops. This year, Scott's birthday will remind me I've spent 20 years in this field, and we've made very modest progress on the real unmet need that I just discussed. So I ask my colleagues here, as I've asked now, that this is the 3rd year in a row that I've been addressing anesthesiologists in our annual meetings. I'm asking the question, will our profession lead in this arena. I believe that one of the answers is this. There's not a doctor in the room who doesn't well appreciate that you could take a device like this and some other things that you would drive the development of and standardize better moderate sedation for pain-producing procedures by doctors. You all know that you could do it. The question in all of your mind is, how would you get paid to do that? And I respect that issue. I'm not a Pollyanna about these issues. It's, we're all in it to make a living, amongst other things. I won't go through the details, but I'm now the chairman and administrator of a health system in Lubbock. So you may notice that I've taken a demotion in career titles. I was a respected cardiac anesthesiologist and a phase inventor. Now I'm just a dumbass hospital administrator. But I will tell you, because of the seat that I sit in, I have some observations about the business realities that we all face. And that is that there's never been a better time for anesthesiologists to negotiate bundles of care. You talk about it every year in this concept of perioperative surgical home. I think now is a great moment in our profession's history to bundle OR cases and sedation throughout the institution as mandated by Medicare under the anesthesia department and negotiate that you get paid appropriately in new ways, not for your labor, but in new ways to set standards, be in charge of training, manage quality and cost and patient satisfaction. I think there's never been a moment where there's been more willingness amongst the commercial payers and influence that could be wielded in the Medicare and other arenas to do that. This little thing that I just said, I was amused to see the connection. I'm not saying this out of any other belief than one that's been long held. It was Dr. Stanley who introduced me to his anesthesia department 18 years ago. And it was at that meeting that I made these very points that I believe this is rightly something that our profession can lead, and I would like to see anesthesia departments and anesthesia professionals actively engage in this and get paid for it. And it was at that meeting that afterwards, Dr. Talmadge Egan came up and introduced himself and said, I'd like to participate in this. I think this is exciting stuff. So, and Talmadge over the years has become one of my dearest friends. So it's fun to see the connections from these things, but this that I'm saying is not new. I've said it every year for 3, and it's amusing. I said the same thing 18 years ago. So with that, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll be glad to take a few questions if you'd like.
All right, thanks a lot for this talk. I think we have time for a few quick questions, if there are any. Peter.
A very quick one, and much more scientific question than sort of the societal implications. So you've probably studied sedation more than anyone else in the world, and I'm curious, how many? But on a larger scale population basis. So how well does the algorithm work? What I'm interested in, do you see outliers? Outliers where you would expect the patient should be sedated with this concentration, with this dosing, and then they either are sort of outliers on either side of the curve, right? Either you cannot sedate them at all, or it's like way over. The basis for this is I have an interest sort of in pharmacogenetics, and when we induce patients, right? I mean, nearly everyone gets 200 milligrams of propofol, right? So we do this in a very crude fashion, most of us, and it's not a single drug. I believe that there may be genetic sort of underlying population variation in the response to, let's say, propofol. How much variation do you see?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes. There is variability. We're all well aware of the variability. The system does a better job, for sure, in identifying those patients and allowing careful titration upward. But then there are patients that you will not safely sedate for a procedure in the range of moderate sedation. And I believe this device will identify those patients, and you'll cancel the case and consult with your anesthesia department because this doesn't fit their needs. So yes is the answer to your question.
Randy, you've been at this for 18 years. Doug has been at it for a long time. How do we make this faster and better and sooner? You guys have experienced it. It's a long road. 18 years, your son is now an adult. Same issue. I mean, it's only allowed in 6 or 8 or 10 institutions yet. Why can't we do this better?
One thing I'll say is that in an earlier generation than Dr. Rains, I think that certainly I experienced it at Harvard in medical school and then at Mass General both. There was this sense that industry was tainted. Industry was ugly. Industry was inappropriate. They were whores, right? They were just there for money. I've seen an evolution in that. I even see it today that you guys would stand and listen to the three of us as an audience is remarkable in my life experience, and I'm delighted to see it. So I do think that if there was a more formal way, the thing that I'm sad about is that there are dozens of you in this room and even more in our conference that have fabulous ideas that would change the world. And I'm all about that. I agree with so many of the things you said, Dr. Stanley, about innovation and what it is and what it's not. So I would like to see our society more supportive, whether it's formally with money. That's a fun idea. I think that ought to be vetted more carefully. But just the culture, I do believe is changing. So the level of a business talk that you gave, Dr. Rains, I would have never given that. I would have been hooted and hollered out of a professional society meeting a decade ago. So it's a remarkable evolution in culture, and I was delighted to hear it today. It was fun for me. So.
All right, thanks a lot. I want to thank you and all the other speakers of this morning. I think we had a great session. I want to also thank the audience for the great discussion. I think we're going to move on to the lunch and business meeting. I'm not sure where it is. It's next door. All right. Thanks a lot.
One other thing I want to say, if anyone wants to talk about and work together on bundling of pricing to be paid in a different way, I would be delighted to participate. I wanted to add that. Thank you.